Well, back to today's top story. National Transportation Safety Board investigators are trying to find out exactly what caused Continental Flight 3407 to go down and crash into a house near Buffalo, New York, killing around 50 people. NTSB is set to deliver a media briefing in about an hour on the latest on this fiery crash. Meanwhile, how safe are the skies? We'll go beyond the headlines and talk to an aviation safety specialist next. Stay with us, everyone. And now it's time to go beyond the headlines, an inside analysis of one of the big stories of our day. Today's focus, the crash of Flight 3407 in New York. While the investigation is still in its initial stages, it's beginning to look as if the rapid buildup of ice on the wings may be the culprit here. Too much ice causes the plane to become heavy and the wings to lose lift in a hurry. One thing we know, whatever happened here, it happened very quickly. Icing has long been a concern of the National Transportation Safety Board, which has been critical of the FAA for not toughening aircraft ice standards since a crash in 1994 in Rosemont, Indiana, where some 68 people perished. As sad as this latest crash is, perhaps a bit of perspective is in order. This is the first fatal commercial airline accident in the U.S. in over 2 years. In 2006, an FAA official said incidents with fatalities occur only once every 15 to 16 million flights. You are 40 times safer on a commercial flight than you are when driving down the interstate. The loss of life is tragic, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 40,000 people die each year in U.S. car crashes. Statistically, 9 Americans will die in a car crash over the course of this program. So if you want to be safer, don't worry so much about flying. Buckle up. And while you're at it, maybe put that cell phone away while you're driving. So how safe are the skies right now? Should you be worried about booking a flight? To go beyond the headlines, we're asking aviation safety analyst Todd Curtis with airsafe.com. Todd, tell us a little bit about the statistics. I outlined some of them, but really, Americans should not worry about the safety of our commercial aviation system.
Well, they shouldn't for a couple of reasons. First, because the number of accidents, the number of fatal events are much lower now than they were 10 or even 20 years ago. And that's due to a whole series of improvements, both in the way the aircraft are designed and the way they're flown. Now, getting back to your point earlier about aircraft and cars, one thing I like to tell people is, yes, if you look at the raw numbers, cars are not as safe as airplanes. They seem to be riskier. But really, if you look at it, there are only a few kinds of car trips where you can really choose between a car and an airplane. Most people aren't going to choose between a car and an airplane if they're going from coast to coast. They're going to take the airplane. Similarly, you can't take a jet to the corner store. But on that very small level of flights where you have a choice between the two, airplanes still are better, but not as outrageously better as it may seem.
Let me ask you this question, though. The NTSB has been on the FAA for some time about trying to do something on the standards for aircraft icing and what should be allowed and what should not be allowed. I would imagine in the days ahead that's going to be a renewed discussion?
Oh, absolutely. You mentioned earlier the Rosemont event from the 1990s. That's still a serious issue, especially with this kind of design of aircraft, a turboprop aircraft with the wings that are on top of the fuselage. They tend to be a little bit more prone to some kinds of icing incidents. But more generally, icing is something that's been widely known in the aviation community. Even the most junior of pilots know that icing is an issue and can lead to very, very severe changes in aircraft performance with just a little bit of ice. So it's going to be interesting to see how this particular incident was treated by all the pilots flying that night.
All right, let me ask you about that. As you listen to all of the data which are coming out from the NTSB little by little as we learn more about what happened that day, is there anything that just jumps out at you?
Well, the thing that really jumped out at me was the fact that until about a minute before the crash, things were more or less normal. There was nothing that seemed to be an emergency. There were no alarms going off. It was only when they started to prepare for landing, lowering the landing gear, changing the flap settings, that things started to go awry. And that's consistent with some kinds of icing encounters. So the direction they're going seems to point toward icing, and it'll be interesting to see how those details pan out.
Todd Curtis, we appreciate you coming here to help us out here on America's News Headquarters. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me.